saw it.
On the screen itself.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Ascension. I'm happy that we're gathered once again as we continue our Jubilee Year of Hope speaker series, and tonight is the third of our talks. It's an honor to welcome back to Ascension Dr. Michael Peppard, a distinguished theologian and professor at Fordham. And Michael brings the Bible and early Christian materials to light by exploring their social, political, artistic, and ritual context. He earned his Ph.D. in religious studies from Yale University, following degrees from Yale Divinity School and from Notre Dame. And beyond academia, Michael is a contributing editor to Commonweal magazine and a frequent commentator on religion and public life, with appearances on CNN, PBS, and other media outlets. And so Michael is the author of several acclaimed books: The Son of God in the Roman World, The World's Oldest Church, and his most recent book, How Catholics Encounter the Bible, the topic of this evening's talk, offers a rich exploration of how Scripture shapes Catholic worship and imagination. So please join with me in welcoming back Michael Peppard. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. I did turn this on. Can you hear me all right? Okay. As Father Carney said, I had the great joy of being here as a parishioner for 6 years, and sadly moved to the suburbs, and suburban Christianity is not as good, I gotta say. But it's great to be back. My daughter had her first confession right over there, I remember, so a lot of wonderful memories here. I want to thank Father Carney and thank Jan and thank Nelson and Preston Smith and others on the leadership here for inviting me. I do have copies of my book in the back. There is no compulsion to buy one, of course, but they're there at the back just in case something that I say tonight is of interest to you. I want to start briefly with my own childhood because it's relevant to my topic. My childhood seemed to be half full of the Bible. Let me explain. My mother was an evangelical Protestant Christian. She would devour daily Sunday, where the pastor held a Bible while preaching straight out of it, and the people took notes in their Bibles. Her shelves held Bible dictionaries, Bible encyclopedias, and Bible quiz games. In the summer, we went to vacation Bible school and Bible camp, and when as a teenager I came home late and tried to sneak in the house, she would be up reading her Bible on the couch, and she'd say, "Sit and read with me." And I'd have to sit and talk to her about whatever she was reading in the Bible at midnight. Later, in her very old age, with her mind blurred by dementia, she still read her Bible devotions. So it was Bible this way, Bible that way, Bible every day. You may see where this is going. As for my father, I have no memory of him ever once reading the Bible. I do believe he owned one late in life, but I never saw him touch it. My Catholic father was at least as religious as my Protestant mother, and in some ways more so. His Bible was missing as a printed text, but it was present in other ways. His many years of Catholic schooling had been full of tales from the Bible. For periods of his life, he went to daily Mass, where he heard portions of the Bible proclaimed and sung and preached upon. His ethical vision was deeply formed by the Bible, a balance of mercy and justice animated by ancient narratives. After a bad cancer diagnosis, he led a parish cancer prayer group in novenas, prayer cycles which used the rosary to meditate on biblical events in the lives of Jesus and Mary. But even after his passing, the Bible on his bookshelf appeared unread. Instead of "sit and read with me," he'd say, "Take me to Mass." When he'd become too feeble to drive himself, that's what he wanted. But even when facing the end, he never asked for me to read to him from the Bible. So during my adolescence, I'm of course trying to figure out my identity amid these two parental influences. Very different spiritualities, but I should say they were married 50 years before they passed away. Once I asked my dad in that teenage time, why don't you read the Bible? And he was correctly guessing that I was comparing him to his wife, but he wasn't defensive, and he said, I know what's in it. And I said, oh, do you? And he said, I know the stories. I know the stories. That's one of the seeds that launched this book, honestly, is remembering my dad say, I know what's in it, I know the stories. But he didn't feel he needed to prove himself to me. He knew the stories, and for him that was enough. The stories, the Mass, the prayer, for him, that was the Bible. So it turns out my childhood was not half empty of the Bible. It was completely full of the Bible, but just in ways I didn't understand at the time. Now, of course, later in the Q&A, we can wonder, did he really know all the stories? Or because my research shows that Catholics know some stories extremely well and others are totally new to them. So my book explores this paradoxical role of the Bible for most Catholics, that it's a book central to Catholic tradition, but not in the form of a book. And I have an honest question about this room. I've wondered when I walked in and I went to the 7 p.m. Mass, is there a printed textual Bible in the sanctuary of Ascension? Most Catholic churches do not have one. There's a lectionary, right? But there likely is not one in the room. So Catholics may not be a people of the book, traditionally, but they are a people of the story. Every church-going Catholic can tell the basic story of the Passion narrative, the final days of Jesus' life, even if having never held a printed Bible. Or when Mexican Catholics walk from house to house in the days leading up to Christmas, celebrating Las Posadas. They sing songs and reenact stories of Mary and Joseph's search for lodging, but a biblical text is unnecessary. They walk and sing the story instead of reading it. When Catholics around the world pray the Rosary or the Stations of the Cross, with various cycles of meditations on the characteristics of Jesus and Mary, they call to mind many biblical stories, but do not read them from a book. You can't read when your eyes are closed in prayer. So the main chapters of my book aim to illustrate ways such as these in which biblical stories infuse Catholic life, even though the textual correspondences are not always made explicit. Through chapters on the Mass, the lectionary, devotional prayers, the life cycle of baptisms and funerals, and even some forays into drama and fiction, we can encounter the world of biblical stories in Catholic life. In addition to story, Catholics are also a people of the imagination. And so Catholic art and music and literature brim forth with biblical narrative and imagery, but often not in ways that correspond strictly to the biblical text itself. Consider, for example, what is arguably the most famous piece of biblical art in the world, the Pietà of Michelangelo. If you don't have a handout, it's on your handout, but I'm guessing that you know what it looks like without a handout. This masterwork of sculpted marble is viewed currently by about 10 million visitors per year, situated as it is in the nave of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. Literally countless people have meditated on the grief of Mother Mary as she holds the lifeless body of Jesus. Every viewer enters the drama of the Passion, marveling at the serenity on Mary's face as she nestles her adult child in her lap, like an infant. I just said adult child. The phrase bears tension. Upon further reflection, the viewer notices something wrong with this picture. The ages of the figures are not realistic. Mary's face is that of a young woman, a woman of the age at which she gave birth to Jesus, not of the age of his death. Thus, the artwork causes time to flicker between two moments, between Jesus' birth and his death, between the young woman whose soul would one day be pierced by the tragic fate of the infant in her arms, as prophesied in biblical Luke, and the older man whose body was pierced on the cross, as in the Gospel of John. The renowned sculpture captures the dual biblical mystery of Jesus' incarnation and passion. Now, those who read their Bibles carefully, the textual ones, also know that this scene, Mary holding Jesus' body after the crucifixion, never happens in the text. This most famous piece of biblical art is literally not in the Bible. To find the Pietà in the Bible, one reads between the lines of the text, allowing a process of imagination to unfurl the folds of the story. The text does describe Jesus' mother there at the cross in the Gospel of John. So, of course, she held his body. What mother wouldn't? The vignettes of my book try to show how the Catholic relationship with the Bible has been shaped by this kind of imagination, how devotional meditations on suffering and grace draw on such biblical narratives while going beyond strict correspondence to the text. The Catholic approach to the Bible also focuses in a dramatic fashion, arguably more so than any other Christian tradition, on the two figures of the Pietà, Jesus and Mary. Here they are together, in between the lines of the text, both suffering, both full of grace. And at the end of my talk, I'll return again to the Pietà. Now, much of the Catholic prayer involves visualization in one's mind, not only of what Scripture says, but also of the worlds that might exist between its lines. Many Catholics have learned such methods of prayer from Ignatian spirituality, the 500-year-old tradition stemming from St. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, also known as my employer for almost my entire adult life. So, it's true, I've never really had an adult paycheck of a full-time job that wasn't with the Jesuits. So although a layperson, I'm very much involved. And I know you have Father James Martin, the most famous American Jesuit, coming here next month. The worldwide Jesuit educational system has left its mark on the prayer lives of so many Catholics. And in the summation of Jim Martin, he says, quote, "Ignatian contemplation encourages you to place yourself imaginatively in a scene from the Bible. For example, if you're praying about Jesus and his disciples caught in a boat during a storm on the Sea of Galilee, you try to imagine yourself on board with the disciples, and you ask yourself several questions as a way of trying to place yourself in the scene." Now, of course, biblical visualization in prayer existed long before the Jesuits, and we have models in medieval mystics such as St. Teresa of Avila, St. Bonaventure, and St. Hildegard of Bingen, among many others. And this imagining of the world between the lines of the text isn't really a method of interpretation in the sense that a method might yield similar results by different users. I think rather biblical visualization is more like opening up a mental sense to the possibilities of meaning. And it can lead to beauty, it can lead to fear, it can lead to confusion, it could lead to compassion. Sometimes people tell me they don't do that. They don't do such acts of imagination. They just stick to the text, right? There's a conversation I'm in a lot. And one question I often ask in that moment is I say to a Bible-reading Christian, I say, okay, good. When Mary met the angel Gabriel and received the message of her miraculous pregnancy, where was she? I'll give you a moment to ponder. And those brave enough to answer my question usually say, at home? They don't know. But the text doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us anything about where she was. It says Nazareth. That's not very specific. So anything that, if you think you know in that moment when I ask you, all of that has been provided by your imagination. Now, the role of Christian art is very prominent in this. And you can't go in any major museum in most of the world without seeing an image of the Annunciation, right, of one kind or another. But with or without that history of art, our imaginations are always already doing that work of filling in the story when the details aren't given to us. In my book, in fact, I argue that this Annunciation story is the consummate Catholic biblical encounter. If you think about it, it's a one-woman, one-minute story told in one source. Think about the influence of this, the outsized influence of this story. A Catholic can't go to Mass if you go all year long, like a regular Catholic, devout Catholic. you cannot avoid hearing it every year. It is the first thing you do in the rosary. You can't visit, like I said, any major art museum without seeing it. For many centuries, you couldn't walk through a town in Europe without hearing the bells ringing for the Angelus. And the text of the Angelus prayer is just the text of the Annunciation combined with another text. So from the papal balcony, the Angelus, all the way to a peasant hut in Nicaragua, the Annunciation is interpreted globally all the time, everywhere. It's by far the most famous scene of the most famous woman in the world's largest religion. And it is often formed to define even what femininity is, which I'll get to in a second. Thinking about just the lectionary and the liturgy, besides the appearance of this story on the Sunday of Advent, it's also prescribed for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a holy day of obligation, I hope you went, and the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is a major holiday for hundreds of millions of Catholics. So a lot of people hear it 3 times a year, that one story. If they go on the feast of its own solemnity, the Annunciation, they hear it again. You're getting my point. If we extend the story just a few verses to include when Mary visits Elizabeth, then we have the Magnificat, which would bring in 3 more occurrences of this story into Mass, and also the daily prayer of the Magnificat at Vespers. So I feel very confident that this is the story that has the most outsized influence based on how much text we have in the textual Bible. But let's even go outside of that, outside of Mass. We have the Annunciation getting even more airtime through devotions and prayers, such as the Hail Mary, of course, the Angelus. And I think the Angelus even manifests what it describes, if you think about it in this way, that the Angelus traditionally interrupts people. It interrupts them in whatever task they're doing to invite them into a divine encounter. And when those bells, Angelus bells, ring for centuries, it actually then spurs people to pray with a text that's about a divine interruption. So it's really manifesting what it describes in their lives. I already mentioned Las Posadas, the Latin American tradition, mostly in Mexico. This is also a celebration of the Annunciation, along with the Nativity. And this house-to-house liturgical drama ritually enacts Mary's search for a temporary dwelling to give birth, just as the Word of God sought a temporary dwelling on earth. It has often been called a festival of acceptance, in which the willingness of Mary to accept the unexpected pregnancy is imitated by the willingness of each night's posada to welcome unexpected visitors. Many of the seasonal songs for Las Posadas, like Christmas carols called villancicos, they put the biblical story on the lips of the participants. So even though they're not carrying Bibles with them, they are singing this story. And in fact, some of the earliest attested Spanish villancicos in New Spain, modern Mexico, some of the oldest Christian hymns we have in the Americas, guess what they're about? The Annunciation. We have these in the Quechua language in Peru. We have also them in various languages of what's now Mexico. Now, prayer with the Annunciation does not have to mean obedience. It doesn't have to mean submissiveness. In fact, devotees of Our Lady of Guadalupe, for instance, in my research, I find that their inspiration in the story of the Annunciation, and I'll quote one here, says, quote, "to move beyond the limits of socially constructed images of themselves as a force that moves women to transgress subjugation," end quote. As for the musical traditions of Catholicism, there are innumerable settings of the divine bond between Mary and Jesus, from ancient chants even to modern rock and roll. Throughout the tradition, the Annunciation has been central to many influential Gregorian chants. This is for the traditionalists in the room, right? You have your Ave Maris Stella, you have your Ave Regina Caelorum, you have your Alma Redemptoris Mater. The Annunciation features in all 3 of these, 3 of the 4 most common Marian chants in medieval European Christianity. And that, of course, as I said, comes over to this continent and Latin and South America as well, in the kind of hybridization of presenting the Annunciation in indigenous languages along with traditional music. And in our own day, we have the Ave Maria through Franz Schubert and Charles Gounod and others that we all know well. Through all of this, the Annunciation has also had a profound influence on gender norms and how people think about femininity. So I've done a lot of reading in this area to try to understand how Catholic women perceive this text and how Catholic men who have power perceive this text. And I'll just give a few quotes here from some prominent and some non-prominent folks about this. Because it's quite fascinating how this one woman story can have so many different interpretations. Some Catholic readers have emphasized Mary's obedience through a vocal affirmation that accepts this unplanned pregnancy. And others characterize her with a kind of holy silence. So Pope Benedict XVI, for example, uses the Annunciation to promote silent reverence in worship. And he writes, quote, "Tradition teaches us that the mysteries of Christ all involve silence. Only in silence can the Word of God find a home in us, as it did in Mary, woman of the Word, and inseparably woman of silence. Our liturgies," he says, "must facilitate this attitude of authentic listening," end quote. By contrast, in her book, Truly Our Sister, theologian Sister Elizabeth Johnson responds to such characterizations of Mary. She writes, quote, "At its worst, the emphasis of some interpreters has led to that ideal of woman as an obedient handmaid, passively receptive to male commands, which women today find so obnoxious," end quote. Now, if we go to Nicaragua, to a base community, one of the most famous base communities in Solentename, 1960s and 70s, this community of readers who recorded all of their dialogues about the Gospels, they agreed that Mary is not passive and that she inspired them to interpret her obedience differently. One member of their weekly dialogues on the Gospels remained in admiration of her obedience, but, quote, "This obedience is revolutionary because it's obedience to love. It commands us to disobey everything else," end quote. Similarly, a women's Bible study group in San Cristobal de las Casas, Mexico, felt empowered by Mary's example. Before their Bible study group, this group said, quote, "They felt sorrowful, solitary, silent, and enclosed. This was our reality inside our homes and our daily lives that we didn't choose and that we thought we had no way to change," end quote. But questioning biblical traditions that had reinforced their subservience enabled them to, quote, "discover their own agency and new understandings of God." And this reminds me that in the Gospel of Luke, the source for this story, the one who's silent before God at the beginning is not Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Zechariah, father of John the Baptist. So it's actually the man who loses his voice, and it's the woman who finds hers. Now, many images of the Annunciation, if you notice on the handout, there was an outline. I can't help being a teacher, but we're moving now past the Annunciation on the handout. Many images of Mary with Jesus have been adapted in the visual arts, right? Annunciations in every museum, and so on. But there's one underappreciated musical example that I want to highlight here, which comes from Bruce Springsteen. We're switching gears quite a bit. This is the rocker that you associate with open roads, union cards, and dozens of hard luck but laughing and loving through it all hit songs, right? For over 50 years, culminating in his acclaimed 2016 memoir, Born to Run, and his one-man liturgy of story and song, Springsteen on Broadway, the boss has made sustained contributions to the Catholic imagination. We can follow his characters through darkness and danger, ecstasy and exaltation, love and loss, feasts and fasts, and we can encounter a sacramental worldview that passes on biblical themes to its listeners. An example of how Springsteen does spiritual exercises with the Bible, shaped by his Catholic imagination, comes in a very little-known ballad that he wrote called Jesus Was an Only Son. It's from an album 2005, 20 years ago, called Devils and Dust, where he's really kind of stirring up his own past and his own childhood. During the tour in support of that album, he introduced the song by describing his Catholic upbringing. And it's clear he was workshopping material that would later go into the memoir. He described a childhood, quote, surrounded by God and my relatives. That's how he describes his childhood. The church, he says, exuded mystery and terror. And there was also great beauty in it and enormous poetry. And it sort of worked its way into all my songs. I wrote a lot of songs about parents and children on this record. And so I thought, I'm going to try to write something from the standpoint of Jesus as someone's child. What it's like to have your children choose their own destiny as they do. And of course, you're along for the merry ride wherever it goes, end quote. I'd like now to play and sing this song for you. It's a little bit unusual for a professor to come in here and say, I'm going to sing for you, but you came out here on a weeknight, so we are on Broadway, let's have, and what I want to do is it's a very short song, the piano's right here. I want to play the song and sing it, and then also interlace what he did live, which is a spoken word meditation 20 years ago. And then he stopped, after that tour, he's never played the song again. So it's a kind of deep track and a relic where he's clearly thinking through his own childhood and his thick Catholic background. So I'll play it quickly and then interpret it a little bit as we come to a close. Preston Smith said I could do this. It was approved. The lyrics are on the handout too, if you can't hear my voice, on the back. Jesus was an only son as he walked up Calvary Hill. His mother Mary walking beside him in the path where his blood spilled. Jesus was an only son in the hills of Nazareth as he lay reading the Psalms of David at his mother's feet. The first thing you realize when you have a kid is there's this feeling that appears in your gut. There's nothing you wouldn't do. No train you wouldn't step in front of to keep him safe. And that's a life sentence. Mother, pray, sleep tight, my child, sleep well, for I'll be at your side. No shadow, no darkness, no tolling bell could pierce your dreams this night. And I also figure if our choices are given wing and meaning by the things that we sacrifice, and we choose some part of life, and you give up something else. I always figured Jesus must have been thinking, what's he going to lose? He must have been thinking, Galilee, really nice this time of year. Little bar down by the beach. He's sure they need someone to manage the place. Mary Magdalene, she could come along. And you don't have to quit the preaching. Just save it for the weekends. They could have kids. Get to see the sun fall on their face. Get to see the air fill their lungs. Get to see the next day. And the next day. And the next day. next day, the next day. In the garden at Gethsemane, prayed for the life he'd never live. He beseeched his heavenly Father to remove the cup of death from his lips. Now there's a loss that can never be replaced, a destination that can never be reached, a light you'll never find in another's face, a sea whose distance cannot be breached. Well, Jesus kissed his mother's hands, whispered, "Mother, still your tears. For remember, the soul of a universe willed a world, and it appeared." Forgot you were all here for a minute. The form and the content of the music couldn't not be simpler. But the biblical reflection, I argue, is deceptively deep. The lyrics resemble one of St. Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises. Springsteen enters the biblical landscape and imagines Jesus simply as someone's child. What would he look like learning his ABCs? Would he have nightmares? How would he feel about his fate, knowing he would leave his mother bereft? The biblical evidence for Jesus' relationship with his mother is very sparse. So anyone who wants to think about this relationship, by definition, has to do some reading between the lines, has to do some imagining. With each stanza, he recalls a biblical theme, but either redefines or reimagines its power. The title and first line already do just that. In the biblical tradition, and the subsequent creeds of the Catholic Church, who is Jesus the only son of? Only son of the Father. For centuries of Christian theology, that was a debated theological and philosophical point. But here we meet Jesus as an only son of his mother, and the meaning of the phrase changes when one focuses on the mother. It evokes education, protection, and care, but also profound loss. Grace meets suffering, as Mary Grazia Plena, full of grace, is also Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowful mother. So when did this Jesus feel most like an only son to Mary? Both when he approached his final fate and during his early childhood years. Most of the verses meditate on suffering, but verses 2 and 3 express the grace of the everyday. What do mothers do every day with their children? They teach them, they read with them, they play with them. Jesus would naturally be learning with the most memorable texts of the Jewish tradition, the Psalms of David. Springsteen had seen plentiful artworks of the Madonna and Child, images like a late medieval sculpture at the cloisters on your handout, in which Jesus sits in his mother's lap and realistically points at the pages of a book she holds with her right hand. Perhaps they read from the Psalms, the most well-worn Old Testament pages of the Catholic tradition. The Psalms prepare Jesus to understand and interpret his destiny as a suffering Messiah, a fate from which his mother strives to protect him, just like her left hand in the statue protects him from falling off her lap. Then in verse 3, he evokes the prophecy that Mary's heart would be pierced by her son's death in Luke 2, a text which he probably learned through the Rosary's meditation on the suffering mother and the corresponding artwork with 7 swords piercing her heart. But he recasts the image as a hopeful wish from mother to son. She doesn't want even his dreams to be pierced with any sadness. And then through this, Springsteen's Mary utters an ironic prophecy of her own. Later in life on Calvary Hill, she would again be, quote, by his side, but he'll be under the ominous shadow of a darkened sky. She protects him as far as she can. At Springsteen's imagined Gethsemane, he interlaces that poignant spoken word meditation about the inner thoughts of Jesus that night. He performs what Catholics might call a lectio divina on the temptation of Jesus to walk away from his destiny, the temptation to come down from the cross and to save himself, which is biblical in origin in Mark 15. Come down from the cross, save yourself and us. And this is famously expanded by the novel and film Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis and Martin Scorsese. But in that spoken word of this repeated mantra of hope for the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day, he brings that last temptation of Christ vividly forward from one line of Scripture. The temptation is to be normal, to live a normal life. I would say that this is a live Ignatian spiritual exercise that he wove into a written one that he's doing there on the stage. The meditation then ends by recapitulating the childhood scene. Mary comforted Jesus as a boy afraid of his dreams. Now Jesus comforts Mary as he approaches a fearsome demise. And this too is biblical. It's rooted in the biblical witness as Jesus cares for his mother from the cross in John 19 and addresses the women of Jerusalem on his way there in Luke 23. And the Stations of the Cross transmit both Station 4, the meeting with his mother, and Station 8, the meeting of the women of Jerusalem. So to conclude, how was Springsteen's Jesus an only son? To him, he was an only son of his mother at the cross, and he was an only son of his mother during his childhood. The chronology of the poem oscillates only between those two time periods. In other words, the poem, the song, the spiritual exercise is nothing less than his pietà. With a faith formed by the Catholic biblical imagination, Gospels, Psalms, devotional prayers, family bonds, and indeed Michelangelo's sculpture itself, Springsteen sings the inner thoughts of those marble figures. In the Bible, as in everyday life, grace and suffering flicker back and forth, extraordinary shining through the ordinary, in birth and in death, surrounded by God and our family. Thank you for listening. Of course. Happy to be here. Hello. Sure. Yeah.
Bells rang, and it was an absolutely incredible experience. Whatever people were doing on the beach, some swimming, some suntanning, whatever, everybody just stood up, and some of them knew the Angelus by heart. Others may not even have been Catholic. They stood up because everybody else was standing up until the Angelus was complete. It was absolutely an incredible experience.
Thank you. As someone born after Vatican II and after so many changes, I love hearing stories about when the culture was a little bit thicker, right, or in that way. There are still places where this is the case, but not quite as much right here. In my research for the book, in the section where I was researching that particular devotional prayer, I was amazed to learn that there's a famous French painting just called L'Angelus, the Angelus, which is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and I had seen it before. But what I didn't know is that it has been reproduced in so many French homes, even homes that are in no way church-going. But this particular image is kind of a vestige of traditional Catholicism that is very meaningful to French Catholics. And that was new to me when I was learning about this. So the seeds are there for that coming back always. Hi, yes.
Hi. I recognize the major difference between Catholicism and other Christian denominations in the sense that you can't find a Bible generally in a Catholic church, but you walk into any other Christian church and you can even ask for a Bible and they don't have it. They're readily available. And I grew up in a household where my mother was Catholic, Roman Catholic, and my father was Anglican, English Catholic. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, insisted that her grandchildren had to be Catholic, but my father couldn't worship fully in the Catholic Church, so we would attend both churches.
Yes.
Now the liturgy is pretty much the same, so that's not a problem. But I would only get Bible study on my father's side. And whenever my father and my mother discussed it, my father would say the difference between the churches is that other Christians read the Bible and the Catholics ask the priest what's in it. And that was always what was said when we were growing up. And so I grew up with both, and to me both were important because I grew up with the liturgy. I mean, in the Roman Church we call it the Mass, in the Anglican communion they call it the Eucharist, but it's the same. So I grew up with both, and to me both are really important because the liturgy and all of the ritual is important to me, but also reading the Bible is important to me too, so I like having both.
Well, I love your story, and the anecdotes connect very well to my own. But we can, I guess, a couple things I would say. First of all, I would say that the idea of Catholics today asking officials what's in the Bible doesn't feel to me what's representative of 2025. I do think that there was a time where that was the case, where the books were for the priests and no one else interacted with them.
Well, that even happened when I'm a graduate of Fordham University and got my bachelor's there.
Wonderful.
And I remember there was one time while I was studying that I went to the library because I wanted to look up something in the Bible, and the priest approached me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm just reading something in the Bible." He said, "No," and he took it from me. He said, "Ask me your question." And I said, "Never mind," and I went home and I looked it up there. And granted, that was a few years ago. But
Sure, I mean, I can't deny those stories exist. I'm sorry that happened to you. That's very much a power move, but it's also I mean I think it is the practice in some cases. It also fulfills a Protestant stereotype of Catholics, right? Or kind of the attack line, you might say. I think a turning point, if I'm thinking about a turning point, something like when Pope John Paul II added stations to the Stations of the Cross. And he added mysteries to the Rosary. Added mysteries to the Rosary because he wanted to fill out the biblical story in the Rosary. And he was kind of hearing the criticism from the Protestant world and these sorts of things in Latin America, where Catholics are becoming Protestant because they know the Bible better, and there's some other reasons too. But they're saying, well, we can take some of this criticism, a bit late from the Reformation, but we can take some of this criticism. And one of the things he did was he filled in, the Rosary's mysteries are the beginning of life and the end of life. And so he filled in the luminous mysteries, which are stories from the middle of Jesus' life. and he really wanted the rosary to connect more to the textual Bible, and specifically wanted to encourage people who were devoted to the rosary to also read the stories while they were praying the rosary. And so I think in the 80s and beyond, there was an attempt to, I'm not trying to be defensive of it all, but just kind of there was an attempt to honor that textual witness and bring some of it back in. But the data still, no doubt, shows that if I were to say to you that someone is a devout Catholic who never reads the Bible, and I were to say to you someone is a devout Southern Baptist who never reads the Bible, those are extremely different sentences. The second one is almost impossible to imagine, a devout Southern Baptist who never reads the Bible, right? The orientation of the spirituality and of the religion is around that book. But there has been a somewhat of an increase in Catholic Bible reading from the 1970s to the present, for sure. But even when you drill down in the data there and look at the percentages of Catholics who read the Bible, what they're often reading are the lectionary readings for this next Sunday. So they'll be in a small Christian community, or they'll be in a base community in Latin America, and they'll get together and do Bible reading and discussion, which is great. But they're usually prepping for the same lectionary readings for Sunday rather than exploring the entire book of Joshua or something like that. So there are still some very, very big differences. Sure.
So first, thank you, Michael. It's great to hear you. And by the way, Michael did a great interview with Commonweal Magazine. It's on the podcast. It's really worth listening to.
Thanks.
Really was very, this is my Sunday favorites. In your chapter on the Bible and Catholic worship, you have a really important section on the women missing from the Sunday readings. So when your father said, I know the stories, you made a little comment like, does he know all of them?
Yeah.
And which I thought was very important. I know you did a ton of research, so many images, and also Michael wrote an article about the use of art to demean like Mary Magdalene, and he had a picture of our Mary Magdalene.
I should have said that. This is in the book. I put an image of that art in the book, yeah.
As an example of reversing the demeaning posture. But I'm just going to ask, I think I might know your answer, but because you list the highlights of the women who are missing.
Yeah. And
I was very happy to hear you talk about Phoebe. Michael also has a great article called Household Names on Phoebe, Julia, and Krista. But that's a common rail. Download it. So I don't know if you could comment, like, as Catholics, I feel like we're starving for the full text. And we're actually involved in a project proposing supplemental lectionary or simple ways in parishes that we can bring these women, and we're going to start like it's 10 or 12 because there's 40 or whatever. So who would you start with? If Cardinal Roche said, Michael, we're going to revise the lectionary, we're going to do it slowly. You can add 4 women to Sunday. Who would you add?
if you didn't hear the question, it was if lectionary reform, what women would I choose? What biblical women would I add to the lectionary? Yep. So let's see. Before I'm going to answer while I ponder. The first thing I would say is, without even adding any, you could eliminate the brackets from some of the lectionary readings. So, when they visit the temple and Simeon and Anna are both prophets in the temple who greet the infant, if a presider wants to do a shorter version, then they can cut out Anna from that reading, whereas the gospel writer Luke has very clearly and very intentionally throughout Luke and Acts included more of these stories of women pairing along with male disciples. So even without adding anything, you could just have a different directive about shorter and longer readings. If you're going to add, I mean, the number one is not surprising, but Mary Magdalene in John 20 should have her own Sunday. Or the Easter Sunday reading should just be 6 or 7 verses longer. I mean, that's the easy one, I would say. I know it's also near and dear to your heart, but when you go, it frustrates a lot of presiders too. By the way, it's not just lay people that find that frustrating, that you go from the Easter foot race to doubting Thomas, and Mary Magdalene's story is on a weekday, when not a lot of people are going to church. So that's definitely the number one. I think Lydia is a great story to have more of an emphasis on. If you don't know the story of Lydia, it's in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 16, and the disciples, Paul and others are traveling, and they get to a town, and it's the Sabbath, and they meet some women who are praying, kind of down by the water, and it says that they are worshipers of God. And it's unusual because you think, well, wouldn't they just say they're Jews? Well, no, it seems that they are non-Jews, but who are attracted to monotheism, right? They're Gentiles who are attracted to monotheism, and Lydia is mentioned by herself and not listed as a part of any partnership, which as a historian of the period in the Roman Empire, I would say almost certainly means that she's a widow, that she's a wealthy widow, and that she's running a business. It says she's a dealer in purple cloth. I could go on very long about this, but my point is, it says she prevails upon them, is a good translation of the Greek, to come to her house. And so you could take a minimal view of this and just say the disciples are tired and they need a place to stay and they're crashing at this nice person's house who they met. Or you could take a larger view of it and say Lydia is hosting a house church in the mid-1st century. Because at the end of Acts in 1640, after they do everything they're doing in Philippi, they go back to her house. It's not just a one verse. So that's one that I feel like it's so unknown, and it's so like ripe for interpretation and people to realize that there's all kinds of influential and dynamic women in the Bible who are hiding in plain sight if the lectionary doesn't, shine the spotlight on them. So that was only two, but we could go on and on. I mean, I talk about Phoebe in the book as well, but we could go, we could keep going.
Any other questions?
Not a question, but just in my earlier years, my experience, and I don't think I'm too far off, is that every Catholic home, at least in the Midwest where I grew up, had a Bible.
Yep.
There's, maybe people didn't read it. I remember reading Genesis and getting very bored.
Yeah.
And then I didn't get too much further than that.
Yeah.
But if nothing else, you needed the Bible, so you had a list of everybody who was in your family.
Yes, so a family Bible tradition to kind of keep those records is definitely common in certain cultures. But I think you kind of said what I would say, that owning it doesn't mean it's being read, right? Or having access to it. I mean, the access to the Bible has not been a problem for 500 years, right? It's very, very widespread. That's obviously the revolution of the printing press. So the access and the use are quite different in the tradition. But really, I mean, I'm always trying to point out that if one does participate in Catholic life, they are hearing an awful lot of the Bible. They're hearing a lot of the Psalms. They're hearing a lot of the Gospels are very, very well represented. The epistles are also reasonably well represented. What you're missing out on are some of the longer stories of Israel, right? Some of the longer narratives of Joshua, of Judges, of David and Solomon, and those sorts of things. But a devout Catholic is hearing quite a bit of the Bible, encountering it that way.
Dr. Peppard.
Yeah.
I heard it on art class, we were told that the reason why there was so much imagery in the Catholic Church was because it developed in a time of illiteracy for most of the early Christians, as against
Yes, so the uniting of the printing press and the Reformation, I mean, you cannot separate these two things, and the development of literacy. But mass literacy doesn't come right away, right? That's a much later story. But even there, the Bible is essential to mass literacy. So there was a great book written by Stephen Prothero, a professor at Boston University, written, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago now, titled Religious Literacy. And it was about more than one thing, but when I bought the book, I thought it was going to be about how we need to know more about religion, why did we forget all this stuff about religion? And some of that's true, but he also very, very clearly shows how people learn to read by learning biblical sentences. Even in public schools in the United States in the 1700s, 1800s, that basically learning to read was learning to read the Bible for most of Protestant Europe. It's not like you were learning to read for other purposes. So I think you're right, and I think that, but I wouldn't, to go back to the Catholic part of it, I wouldn't say it was just the artwork that's the mode of encounter. I would bring a lot more things in. So liturgical drama is a huge part of European Christianity before the Reformation, even later, but people coming into a building like this and having a fully costumed, dramatic reenactment of a story. And it's usually from the Gospels, but we have medieval liturgical dramas that are not from the Gospels. There's one from northern France that I just learned about in research for the book that, like, I wish I could have seen it. It sounds amazing. It was a drama about all the prophets of Israel. And they all get kind of characterized. They get costumes. Some of them are funny. Some of them are cranky. Some of them yell at you, and tell you about all the things you've done wrong. And I'm just imagining, and then Daniel and the children of the lion's den, they build a fire in the church and they're throwing people into the fire. I'm imagining this was actually pretty exciting as something to do, for church in this dramatic flair. And so people are getting a lot of Bible stories through those ways as illiterate, right? Without the need to read. So, and when you combine art and drama and pilgrimage and festivals and fast days and like all these things where texts are proclaimed and discussed, I think it opens up our historical understanding, right? Even though they're not doing this, like with the text in a mass literacy way. I don't know if that responded to your question, but that's where my mind went with it.
Michael, thank you very, very much for a very fine presentation. I think a lot of us now are keen to read your book. Michael's book is available in the back of the church. Michael will be in the back of the church. So let's thank Michael.